Bună ziua, stimați telespectatori DC News TV, stimați cititori DC News. Așa cum v-am anunțat în timp, un oaspete cu totul și cu totul deosebit la DC News. Astăzi este vorba despre excelența sa, Ambasadorul Victor Jackovich, Ambasadorul Statelor Unite Victor Jackovich. O să aflați imediat, ambasador în mai multe state, diplomat și în România în vremea lui Nicolae Ceaușescu. Bună ziua, excelența voastră!
Bună ziua, bună seara!
Bună seara, bună ziua! Vă mulțumim că sunteți la emisiunea noastră și că ați acceptat invitația noastră.
Mulțumesc mult, este o onoare pentru mine.
Stimați telespectatori, excelența sa este unul dintre cei mai buni cunoscători ai Europei de Est și ai României. De altfel, dânsul vorbește majoritatea limbilor vorbite aici în regiune. Vorbește foarte bine și limba română, chiar dacă interviul va fi în limba engleză, fiindcă e vorba despre un ambasador al Statelor Unite, dar dânsul vorbește și sârbă, și rusă, și ucraineană și probabil că nu numai. Your Excellency, we'll start the interview by asking you, you've been the cultural attaché in the American Embassy in Bucharest between 1980 and 1983, roughly.
Roughly, yes.
Then you've been ambassador in the Republic of Moldova, first ambassador, as a matter of fact, first ambassador in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the war, ambassador
Correct.
in Slovenia, so you know very well the situation here. How was it? Because simply, I think a lot of our viewers and readers are curious. How was it to be an American diplomat in the Ceausescu's regime in 1980 in Bucharest?
Well, it was, in many respects, it was not easy. And I can tell you this frankly, I spent maybe 3 years here altogether during that time. And what I think was missing was the ability to have the freedom of movement, freedom of conversation with all the people that we wanted to have contact with. Obviously, relations at that time were not really bad between the United States and Romania. They were improving, they were not that bad. But nevertheless, Romania was a socialist country, and it was under a dictatorship, so the United States represented other values. We found ourselves, I think in that embassy at that time, we found ourselves limited in terms of contact, but you know, people are people. And especially in my job as the attaché for cultural affairs, then I found it a little bit more easy for myself along those lines to be able to have contact with a wider group of people, as wide as I could possibly do. Not only with the common people, if I could do that on occasion, but also with the cultural figures at that time, literary figures, musical figures.
And they were important people
like that
here.
Those were important people, playwrights especially, as I remember it. So this was an important time for us to have any contact at all with Romania, and to make sure that even at that time, even with all the restrictions politically, to make sure that the Romanians understood that there was a United States and that there was a United States that had an interest in this part of the world and in Romania.
Sir, we hoped so much that you were going to help us by that time. You know that the Americans were waited in Romania since the end of the World War II. You're aware of that.
Oh, yes.
And I know, I guess, Nicolae Ceaușescu paid a visit in the United States last time in 1979, I guess, when he met President Jimmy Carter.
Yes.
And it looked to us, we hoped very much. I still remember, I was 18 years old. That's a lot of time. I hope very much that the U.S. was going to get involved much deeper in Romania.
Yeah. Well, I think at that time, Romania represented a special country for the socialist bloc, because you were not really part of the socialist bloc in the same sense as the other countries in Eastern Europe. You always had a sense of your own mission, your own independence, relatively speaking.
Yes.
Even at that time. Everything is relative. But even at that time, you had that sense. And I think in the United States, there was a certain amount of encouragement for that, and on the part of the United States government. So the picture in Romania was quite a bit different from the picture that we had in other parts of Eastern Europe at that time.
So you felt since 1980 that Romania was much more ready than, I don't know, Bulgaria, for instance, to look at the Western world, and especially to the United States?
Well, it would be hard to make comparisons but with other countries, but I would say this: I always felt amongst the people themselves, that there was a strong interest in the United States and a strong respect for the United States, which I think we, to the extent we could, we reciprocated towards Romania.
We are in 2022.
Right.
How do you see Romania now? I know you come quite often in our country, and I'm sure you're aware of the situation here.
Yeah, the situation now is extremely interesting because, in my view, the way I look at it, my modest opinion, is that NATO has two pillars in Eastern Europe, on the East European flank, on the East European front of the Euro-Atlantic community. And those two pillars are, in the north, Poland, and in the south, Romania. Now, this southern pillar becomes all the more important after what has happened just recently in Ukraine. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, actually starting in 2014 with Crimea, but after that, the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Romania's position is all the more strategic and all the more important for the region, for the entire Euro-Atlantic community. So I think the important thing to look at is our reliance on you, our reliance on Romania to remain this strong pillar, which I trust that you are, I'm confident that you are, on the southern flank of NATO. And also to have your people to have confidence in us as the United States, that we are here and that we are in cooperation with you, in combination with you. There will come times in the future, I cannot predict it, but I can foresee possibly a time in the future when we will be working together even more than we are now, cooperatively, because of this threat from the East.
That will change probably, also, let's put it like this, it changed the interest of the United States from the north more to the south. It's not only the Baltic Sea, but it's also the Black Sea.
Well, I can tell you this. Your Romanian leaders, diplomats, and representatives were always warning us that the important part is the Black Sea. They were always telling us this. And I think because we looked at the relative stability in the region, and we looked at the problems in the north with the Baltic countries and the fact that they were actually Soviet republics.
That's right.
We looked at that and we said, well, the dimension right now, the emphasis right now is on the northern area, the feeling that there is a danger there, they are vulnerable. Now, of course, we should have listened to you many years ago when you were telling us about this, but now I think we have incorporated more of the Romanian theorizing about this and the Romanian thinking about the importance of the Black Sea.
Sir, how do you see the war in Ukraine right now? How would you assess what's going on there? There are a lot of stories that this war could be avoided if the West, and especially the United States, which is the leader of the free world, could warn Putin before the war that there is a red line over there and he cannot step on it, and Putin could be convinced that he will not attack Ukraine due to the problems he actually made to the whole world, not only to this part of the world.
I think there was a period of time after the fall of the Soviet Union, and symbolically we have just witnessed the passing of Gorbachev, for example.
Did you know Gorbachev?
No, I did not. But I served in the Soviet Union twice, just to make a digression.
Yes.
I served there twice, once in the late 1970s and again in the 1990s. The first time I was actually expelled. I was expelled from the Soviet Union. I was working, and it was nothing I did. Of course, everyone says that, but I was working in Ukraine, at the time, but it was Soviet.
As an American diplomat.
As an American
But
diplomat.
in the Soviet Ukraine.
Soviet Ukraine. And it was following the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And we took very many measures reciprocally back and forth, boycotting the Olympics, not selling certain technology, things of this nature. And far down on the list was the mutual expulsion of diplomats.
Yes.
And I was on that list because I was in Ukraine working there, and so I was tossed out. But you know, it's very interesting because during Gorbachev, you mentioned Gorbachev, during Gorbachev, perestroika, glasnost,
Yes.
I actually returned to the Soviet Union. It was kind of an experiment by the US government. This person was thrown out. Can we return him to the Soviet Union for work there? And they did. And I was accepted, and there were no problems during that time. But your question is about
yes.
Ukraine and the war
Yes.
in Ukraine, I think.
And if the war could be really avoided by the early intervention of Washington towards Moscow.
I started saying that, you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a period where we were trying to enmesh the Soviet Union into, and Russia, once the Soviet Union had fallen, into a network of cooperation. A network of cooperation together with the West. I don't think anyone was daydreaming that Russia would become part of NATO or Russia would join the European Union. Nothing like that. But at least have a cooperative relationship so that there would not be the mutual hostility. And this led us into a period where, for example, when things happened, we had a rosy picture of Putin when he first came in 2000, for example. We had a rosy picture of Medvedev when he succeeded Putin for a period of time.
Yes.
And, you know, it was a little bit too rosy. At the same time, we were receiving warnings from Romania
Yes.
and from other countries that, you know, things may not be as nice as you think. And you were right. Because then I think the problem became that we did not react, in my opinion, and I'm saying this today because I am a common citizen, I'm no longer a representative of the US government. We did not react strongly enough, for example, on the situation with Georgia. When there was the...
In 2008.
In 2008, when there was the invasion of Georgia, we did not react strongly enough, in my opinion, to that. In fact, less than 1 year, we were having meetings in the State Department and the Oval Office to have a reset with Russia, less than 1 year after the invasion of Georgia. Then came, of course, the situation with Syria, then came Crimea. Our reactions to these things were not as strong as they should have been. So when you ask, could there have been a warning? Could there have been a warning to Putin? Possibly there could have been, but on the other hand, our reactions were not so strong towards Russia in its activities, and because of that, I believe the Russians, it was part of their miscalculation. Putin perhaps made 3 major miscalculations on Ukraine. Number one, he overestimated the capabilities of his own military forces. He underestimated the resistance of the Russian people and the Russian government. And I think he did not expect the West to be so united and to adopt such effective sanctions.
And those miscalculations made him to fail, at least in these first 6 months, in the invasion of Ukraine, because you cannot call a success what Russia did in Ukraine.
You cannot call it a success. It's been a very brutal war. When I see the footage, film footage of destroyed buildings, corpses on streets, villages that are attacked by heavy artillery, then you know what it reminds me of personally? It reminds me of Bosnia. I was the American ambassador in Bosnia during the war, 1992 to 95. And it reminds me of that, but it reminds me of that multiplied 10 times because the scope of the destruction is much bigger and the territory is, of course, much larger.
We'll come back to Bosnia in a second because I understand that things are going very bad now in Bosnia. Many people say that Moscow is trying to push the regime over there, the government, making those people, Serbs, Croats, Muslims, to fight each other again. And that might be a problem. Sir, how would you consider the help of the West towards Ukraine in this conflict?
Well, so far the unity in that assistance to Ukraine has been very strong. I say so far because I would hope that it would continue. But the real test will be whether the Western states can remain unified in the assistance that they're giving to Ukraine, because Ukraine needs a lot of assistance. It is fighting Russia. This is not one small state against another state. It is against Russia. So they need a lot of assistance. The other test for the West will come over the next several months over the winter, when you have an energy supply problem
Yes.
in Europe, in all of Europe, and we will see then what will be the effect on the people, on the population. Will the population remain convinced, not the governments, the population, remain convinced that there must be a continued unity of the West against Russia even during this time? And I think this war will go on for quite some time. We will not see a short end to this war.
You don't believe the war will end, let's say, in the next 6 months or 1 year?
It could be 6 months to 1 year, but certainly nothing less than that.
Now, it's a difficult question, but I have to ask you, as an ambassador of the United States, we underline the fact that you're a normal citizen now. You don't work for the government
Right.
anymore, so
Correct.
you can give us a free opinion, not a diplomatic one. How do you see this war ending? This is the question which we actually put probably every day.
Every day indeed, and I put it myself every day.
Yeah.
There are days when I'm very optimistic in the sense that I look at the news from the region and I see that the Ukrainians are having more successes than one might expect.
That's right.
And so I say, well, this might be possible to really, they have stopped the advances by the Russian forces, it looks like. So it may be possible to begin to reverse this. Those are my optimistic days. On my more pessimistic days, I wonder about the things I just mentioned, the unity of the West being coherent and being sustained, the sustainability in the Ukraine as well. Because if we're going to have a tough winter in Europe, they're going to have a tougher winter in Ukraine.
I'm afraid so, yes.
Yes.
And for the civilians in Ukraine, it's going to be a disaster. If more than 10 million Ukrainians, they flowed from the country
Yeah.
so far.
Yes.
More than 6 million in Poland.
Yeah.
At the conference, they mentioned that, and more than 2 million through Romania. And we were not the only countries which received refugees. Do you see the conflict in Ukraine ending like the conflict in the Republic of Moldova, with that region which is not recognized by anyone, Transnistria, which is actually under the administration, the direct administration of Moscow, and even if it makes part from the Republic of Moldova and should be under the administration, under the rule of Chişinău, do you see those kind of things like Crimea, Donbass, probably the south of Ukraine, put it in this kind of frozen conflict?
This is, of course, a possibility, but I have to remain an optimist, even though I'm not an American official. I'm an American citizen, and so I come at these things and I view these things in terms of our hopes and aspirations for countries that look to the West, countries that look to the United States. And so I have to look at the situation in Ukraine and say that there is a possibility for the best possible solution, whatever that might be. I can't be in the business of making predictions, even as a former ambassador.
Let's hope indeed that Ukraine is going to receive enough support
Indeed.
To throw back the Russians.
They need this.
They need this.
Yes.
Do you see the Republic of Moldova? You know you are one of the few Americans which perfectly understands the situation between Romania, Republic of Moldova, the historic things, because you opened the embassy in 1991, 1992. You were the first one to open it in Chişinău. Do you see that the Republic of Moldova is under threat of military struggle, or do you think that Russians will act as they used to do before through hybrid channels, political, social, economic, diplomatic, but not military?
Well, Moldova is always under threat because it is a divided country. It's a partitioned country at the moment. The problem is that we let this be the situation for too long a time. For the past, what has it been, 20 years or so, that this has been the situation in Moldova. And I believe, my personal belief is that we should have been stronger in fostering at least negotiations and more pressure on the Transnistria part of the country, and also on Moscow about the situation in Transnistria. We became too inured, too complacent about the idea of frozen conflicts. And I think we needed to understand that maybe for the two sides, Moscow, Washington, a frozen conflict is okay, but it is not okay for the people who live there.
Definitely.
Not okay for the people who have to have a governance there, who have to have a system, who have to have a way of life, who have to have an expectation. And so we should have been stronger. I think Moldova does have a future. It's very interesting that it has been extended, the candidate status, from the European Union at a very early stage.
That was a huge achievement.
That is quite amazing, frankly, when you look at what happened before. No one would have expected this. Of course, it's the result of the warfare in Ukraine. But however it was achieved, and it's a major step.
This wonderful lady, Maia Sandu, the president of Moldova, she needs a lot of support.
Yes.
Romania is not in the position to give all the necessary support because it has its own problems. Do you think the West, and especially the United States, are going to support Maia Sandu and her democratic regime in making all the necessary reforms in the Republic of Moldova?
I think we're going to support democratic governing systems in Moldova, in as much as they look to European standards, Euro-Atlantic standards and values, whether it is the Sandu government or another government. We are interested in supporting those governments that are in alliance with us philosophically, in terms of our values and in terms of our standards.
The Republic of Moldova is going to need gas this winter. Nobody has gas to give to the Republic of Moldova. That will be a hard time, and probably Moscow is going to attack politically by that time, in 3 months from now. Sir, do you think that the strategy, the military political strategy of the United States towards Europe is going to be focused on Eastern Europe? Because for decades they were focused on Western Europe, which was the good part of the Iron Curtain.
Well, I think it is focused on Eastern Europe. We were extremely instrumental in supporting the entry of states in Eastern Europe into the European Union, where we are not a member. Nevertheless, we supported that. And of course in NATO, where we are the leading member. And we supported that very much. Many people do not realize, but there was a debate about this in the United States at the time. There was no, I wouldn't say that there was 100% consensus about enlarging NATO as quickly as we did to countries like Romania in Eastern Europe. But we did this, and we did this with continued discussions with people internally in the United States. In the United States, you must understand, there are a lot of people who are frustrated with the international community, frustrated with the international situation, frustrated with the amount of aid and support that we give to other countries. And they're frustrated by their own domestic political situations. So that the debate in the United States We are in a constant effort to make sure that people are educated about what is NATO, what is the European Union, why is it important to support these organizations.
Because we live in a global world now.
Why is Romania important? You know, before you join NATO and before you join the European Union, if I travel around the United States and ask people about Romania, they don't really know too much about it. They have a vague conception that it exists somewhere in Eastern Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Once you join these clubs, the Euro-Atlantic Community, the European Union, and NATO, I can tell you honestly, even the common American citizen who does maybe not, he's not too engaged in international affairs or political affairs, he's heard of Romania, he knows Romania, and he appreciates Romania.
So it's
You
much,
have a new profile.
it's much better known, Romania, as it was before,
Oh,
after
much
we
better.
joined NATO and EU.
You have a higher profile. You're a member of the club. Not only a member, but you are a, as I said earlier, a pillar. You are somebody that is working hard to be to make the contribution. Not only that, but we rely upon you, and hopefully, I know you can rely upon us as well in the United States. It's a strategic partnership. The strategic partnership that was signed several years ago between our countries was not just rhetoric. It was not just a diplomatic document. I think it was real. There was a spirit behind it that was very real.
Yeah, it was proposed first time in 1997,
Yeah.
when President Emil Constantinescu and the ambassador of Romania in Washington, Mircea Joana at the time,
Mircea Joana
Now-
Constantinescu, exactly.
yes,
Yes.
they launched it when President Bill Clinton came to Bucharest.
Yes.
And we own that. Everything happened, I guess, because of the wonderful work that Ambassador Alfred Moses, who was the American ambassador in Bucharest by the time, made here and in Washington. So after Romania was rejected at the NATO summit in 1997 in Madrid, because we had another summit in Madrid now,
Yeah.
30 years after, almost, 1997, 25 years, Bill Clinton paid a visit in Bucharest. And everybody loved him, and I guess the way that hundreds of thousands of people wave and make a very good welcome to President Clinton, I guess it helped to the American administration and at the time.
Well, if I may add also,
Please.
you had at that time, and you still have, but I mean, you had very good leaders. You had very good politicians. You had very
You
good
think so? Because
representatives.
we believe it's the worst in the world we have.
I'm talking about the person you mentioned, Mircea Joana, for
That's right,
example.
Mircea
currently
Joana.
Deputy Secretary General of
Yes,
NATO.
Mircea Joana. We wait for him in 2024 as President of Romania.
Very possible. He's a very talented person.
Very possible,
Very smart.
yes.
And I think a man with, you would call him that he's foarte deștept.
Foarte deștept.
He is very intelligent, and he knows the West, he knows the East. He
knows
very
US,
good.
which
But
is
you've had other people like, I don't know, Dudu Ionescu,
Constantin Dudu Ionescu,
who
very
was
good person.
the Minister of Interior, Minister of Defense, very strong personality, but also someone who knows these issues very well, and therefore is very respected by people in the West. You had Ion Mircea Pașcu.
Ioan Mircea Pașcu, former Minister of Defense,
Minister of Defense.
2000, 2004,
Yeah.
and many others. That's right.
Many others. You had very talented people. And your current Prime Minister, Nicu Ciucă. You know, I met him.
I know you love him.
Well,
because he served in Afghanistan. You also have been
I
an
met him.
ambassador in Afghanistan.
Well, I had ambassador rank, but I was the United States advisor to the coalition, to the American
In
Army.
Kabul?
In Bagram.
In Bagram.
To
And you
the-
spent time in Bagram.
Yeah, more than a year. I was there at the beginning, 2002, 2003.
My God.
But I can tell you, I met there a young commander of the Red Scorpions from Craiova, and this was Nicu Ciucă. This was Ciucă. And I met him and I talked with him there. The Romanian contingent, I must say, was extremely vigorous. They were extremely talented and courageous. And there were a lot of them. I think you had at one time more than 1,000 troops in Afghanistan,
That's
in
right.
Kandahar, and going up north towards Kabul in that region. I mean, it was really something. And so I met him there. And then I had many talks with him when he was chief of staff. And then I had talks with him when he was Minister of Defense. And now he is your Prime Minister. I'm only saying this because you have a series of very talented people and very wise leaders who I think the people in the West look to and say, well, this is part of the Romanian contribution to the Euro-Atlantic leadership, not just community, but leadership.
Your Excellency, do you think it's possible, because there is one chapter, one part that we are not ready to achieve, the infrastructure in Romania. I know at the beginning of the 60s, you made a lot of infrastructure in Greece, US, directly. Can you do this for Romania as well? For example, a motorway for the Romanian Moldova, because US has troops now in Mihail Cogălnicianu and probably in Fetești. And okay, there is a motorway between Bucharest and Constanța, but we need much more infrastructure. Do you think that would be possible, that US would take care of this? Because we have money from the European Union, but we are not able to do anything with them.
Well, a lot of these things are, of course, commercial based. If an American company sees the need to come into Romania and sees, frankly, the profit, then an American company will do this. It cannot be dictated from the government. On the other hand, you mentioned the military presence here, and I think that may be your adut, that may be your ability to make this more of an imperative for Western companies to do something. Because where the military goes, the military has to have good roads, they must have good infrastructure. So maybe it follows the deployment of Western military in Romania. You know, even in the United States, during the time of Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, that's when the road system was built to the West Coast in the 1950s. We did not have roads, not good roads, in the United States from east to west. It came in the 1950s. Why did it come? Because of World War II and because of the war with Japan and the need to link the entire United States. Where the military goes, very often you have the infrastructure. So I would say that you're in a very good position in that regard.
Sir, in this east part of the world, of Europe, where Romania and Poland are, there are also some countries which have a different attitude towards Moscow right now. I'm mentioning, for instance, Hungary. Do you think that this is going to weaken this part, this flank, or we are going to, it's just commercial between Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin? They already signed a new contract to get even more gas for Budapest.
Well, it's very interesting what has happened in some of the countries of Eastern Europe. You mentioned Hungary. Also, we could say, for example, Poland, where you have regimes, governments that have a populist strain, a populist streak in them. But I must say, I must acknowledge that these are freely elected democratic governments.
That's right.
And if there's one thing we must do, it is to listen to the people. My campaign, or my project in my own head about what we should be doing, is that we must always be talking to the people. In the first instance, we have to listen to the people. What is it that the people want from us? In the case of Romania, what is it that the Romanians want from NATO or European Union or from the United States? But we must also offer opportunities to educate the people. We must also make opportunities where we are telling people in Romania or Hungary or Poland, here is what the Euro-Atlantic community is all about. Here is what membership in European Union means. Here are the benefits, but also the obligations for belonging in NATO. Too often we are a little bit complacent about this. We have believed in the past that we are the leaders of these wonderful clubs and everybody wants to join the club. But look at Brexit. And look at the situation in other countries. If it were not for Ukraine and the crisis in Ukraine, what would happen if you had a referendum on NATO membership, excuse me, in, let's say, in the Netherlands or some other country? What would happen without looking at the situation in Ukraine? We must make sure that we have the support of the people. We cannot assume that because we have wonderful policies, we think they're wonderful,
Yeah.
that the people will support them. The people will support them if they understand them, if they know what those policies are. And then you must be prepared for the divergence. Because if you've done a good job, if you have good policies, and if you have articulated them to the people will likely support them. But you must be prepared for the people to tell you, we think you should go in a different direction. And then you have to either say, we go in a different direction, or you must say, something about my articulation was not good, I have to try again.
Sir, do you think that Russia is going to attack some other countries in this part of the world?
Well, that's very hard to predict. Thanks to the Ukrainian resistance, which is stronger than perhaps anybody anticipated.
Ever anticipated, yes.
Ever anticipated, you're right. Thanks to that, I think the Russians have their hands full with the situation in Ukraine. They are not, of course, they would like to reconstitute what they had before. Of course, they're looking at Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and saying, at least Putin is, and many of his immediate surrounders, are saying this is something that we need to, this is the basis for a resurgence, for a reemergence of a militant Russia, of a respected Russia, of a strong Russia. That could be their thinking. But because of the strong Ukrainian resistance, I think looking beyond the problems that they have in Ukraine is premature for us and for them.
But normally Russia, because we also expected that, normally we were used for Russia to attack in a hybrid way. It looks like they have played a role in the Brexit. They look like they played a role in the campaign in France when they supported Mrs. Marine Le Pen openly. Maybe also some in Italy. There were some rumors with the former President Donald Trump in the United States. Do you think they are going to attack using what they know to use, the fake news, the cyber attacks, and maybe from time to time a terrorist attack, not with their hands, but with some other people's hands?
Well, in fact, this is what I think that I see them doing in Southeastern Europe and former Yugoslavia.
I see.
You know, it's very interesting.
We talked about Bosnia. You believe is their hand over there?
Definitely.
Definitely.
No doubt. No doubt. They have a wonderful, they have a strong relationship with Serbia, for example, in Belgrade.
Yes.
Which also has a strong relationship in half of Bosnia called Republica Srpska.
Republika Srpska.
So yes, you can see this line of influence. You can see this line of support going all the way from Moscow to this area. But a lot of it is, as you described, hybrid. What I find very interesting historically is that President Tito in Yugoslavia was able, after 1948, to keep the Russians completely out of Yugoslavia. And when I say completely, I mean completely. Culturally, in every way, people in Yugoslavia do not speak Russian. They never did, or perhaps in the early 1940s or something. But they never had this indoctrination from Russia. It's very interesting.
Yes.
Today, we look at Russian inroads in Serbia, Russian inroads in Republica Srpska, attempts in Montenegro also. And we look at this and we say, I personally look and I say, well, this is a very different situation than it used to be under President Tito. But it is a new situation. These are small, relatively small, independent states, so they become targets. And they have Serbian populations. You know, the Serbian population, Serbia is an extremely important country. It's a pivotal country in former Yugoslavia and in Southeastern Europe. Absolutely the most important country to emerge from former Yugoslavia, in my opinion. The problem is that the Serbian population lives in many different countries around Serbia. The situation in Russia is very similar, where you have a Russian population that lives in many republics outside of Russia. So you have this parallelism and the good relationship between Serbia and Russia, which means that I believe that Russia definitely has a hand in the Balkans that they never had before. But they're doing this in a very unobtrusive manner. They're doing this through, I would say, philosophical, political means, support to individual movements. They're doing it through the Orthodox Church, which is a linkage between some of the Slavic Orthodox countries. They're doing it in many different ways.
And not to mention Bulgaria, where a very pro-Western government has been thrown away, and now looks like the party of Boyko Borisov is going to win the future elections.
They have elections very soon in Bulgaria, and the Bulgarians, as I understand it, I believe are negotiating now for energy supplies with Russia prior to the elections. So it is a very sensitive situation there.
Ambassador, George Scutaru and his NGO New Strategy Center made a wonderful job, and he invited General Ben Hodge to launch his book in Bucharest. And Ben Hodge gave us a lecture, a very interesting one, and he told us something awful from my point of view. We didn't stress it very much, but we are going to do it. He said, for sure, in the next 5 years is going to be a war between US and China. And that's why Europe has to be prepared to fight against Russia whenever is necessary. Of course, US is going to remain here in Europe, which is a very good news, but we are going to be very much focused into the Pacific. General Hodge is an excellent military, but as an ambassador, do you really believe it can be a war between US, that means the free world, and China?
Not necessarily. We have a very strong interest in what we call the Indo-Pacific region.
Yes.
And many people have talked about a shift, of American security interests from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. I would look at it in a different way. We have strong interest, but we always have had, in Indo-Pacific. But of course we have strong interest, and that will remain the case, in the Euro-Atlantic community and in NATO and in Europe and in Eastern Europe. The United States has always been blessed by having, being divided from every place by two big oceans and by Canada and Mexico. Those are our borders. Those are our only borders. This is why the United States, I'm sorry to say, is very culturally isolated, but that's the case. But it has also been a protection for the United States. But it means that we have, I would say, at least equal interests in Indo-Pacific and in Europe. It doesn't mean that we abandon one to do the other. I think what we're looking at is a new future security situation in Eastern Europe. What it will be, I cannot predict. We cannot predict. But certainly after the crisis in Ukraine and after the Putin decision to invade Ukraine rather than to handle his problems in a diplomatic way, then obviously we will all have a new security situation there. The United States is already making adjustments. We are sending troops, more troops into the Baltic states. We are sending more assets and troops into the Balkan states. And we are forming new alliances with states here. I think that our East European stature is very strong. And thank goodness we have allies in Western Europe that agree with that point of view. So we have German troops in the Baltics. We have French troops all over. We have British troops also in the Baltics and in other places. And we are not alone. It isn't only the United States. It is an alliance effort and a very serious effort.
Sure, but the war between the first GDP of the world and the second, US and China, could completely change the world we are living in. I mean, it's not thinkable. It's a science fiction bad movie, a war between US and the free world, because the free world is going to join US and China.
Well, we can't predict that there will be wars. We must be optimists about our ability to negotiate and our ability to find diplomatic solutions before anything else. So I am hopeful that that is the case, whether it's the Indochina theater or whether it is the European.
Maybe one last question, because we're running out of time, sir. We used to say in Romania that the main problems we have is the non-functional justice system and a very bad administration, non-performant administration, not bad in that sense. I know US was very much interested in having a functional justice, state of law. Do you think that something can be done in this kind of field? Because I'm not talking about only the penal justice. I'm talking about the commercial justice. When you have a tender, the court is going to use 5-6 years until they will give a verdict. And in this time, maybe the offers are not on the table anymore. And this is one of the main reasons why Romania doesn't have infrastructure, because they compete, companies, to build a motorway or a railway, and they sue each other, and you have the problem in the courts, and the courts will give the answer in 5-6 years and so forth.
Well, I know that there are a lot of programs that are funded by the United States government through the American embassy here, just on those topics, on judicial reform, on judicial progress, and the kind of reorganization that I think you're talking about, not only in the corporate sphere, but otherwise. And it is a problem not only in Romania, I can tell you, it's a problem in many countries, especially in Eastern Europe, where the system becomes bogged down. It becomes maybe even there's a legacy from previous years, from previous administrations, previous eras even. Part of it is that. But I think hand in hand we're working on these issues. And there are so many different opportunities that you can avail yourself of from the European Union and from the United States, where the reform efforts can be not only encouraged, but there can be new training for new people. The future of the country rests with the young people. And I'm very impressed with the caliber of the young people, talented young people. You know, I came here, I think the first time I came to Romania was perhaps in the 1970s, and certainly in the early 1980s.
50 years ago.
Yeah, many years ago. And other parts of Eastern Europe, I came even earlier. I was in Yugoslavia for the first time in the 1960s. I was a student in Yugoslavia. And when I look at young people at that time, of course I was a young person myself, but when I look at their capabilities, even things like speaking English, I mean, the level of English speaking in all of these countries, this is not a measure of necessarily of civilization or progress, but if you want to get along in this world, and if you want to be a part of the Euro-Atlantic community, then of course English is the lingua franca. And this is what everyone uses. This is the sign of progress. The young people today, I meet young people here in Bucharest or elsewhere speaking perfect American English. And I say, excuse me, where did you go to school? When were you in the United States? They say, oh, I've never been in the United States. I just learned in school, and I listened, and I studied very hard, and now I speak English like this.
Hollywood,
You have very talented people.
Hollywood, Netflix, the music, they play a huge role in teaching English.
I guess so.
Your Excellencies, thank you so much for the interview you gave us to DECE News and to DefenseRomania.
Thank you.
Stimați telespectatori, ne-ați urmărit pe DECE News, interviul este difuzat și pe DefenseRomania. De asemenea, știrile din acest interviu care va face multe valori, vor fi difuzate pe ambele site-uri în acest sens. Excelența voastră, vă mulțumim foarte mult și vă mai așteptăm la noi.
Mulțumesc și la voi. Mulțumesc.
Pe curând rămâneți alături de emisiunile noastre.